Hello and welcome back to Genesis Designs and Modelcraft, and today I've got a quick look at some new acrylic paint, water-based acrylic paint. Now these are the kind of water-based acrylic paints we're probably all familiar with. I've got some Amorph MIG there, I've got some AK, some Hataka Redline and some Vallejo Model Colour and Model Air. And those of you who've been around here for a while probably noticed that I really don't use water-based acrylic paints much. I don't really enjoy them at all. All of my paints, I do have acrylics that can be thinned with water, but they are Guns Aqueous Hobby Colour and Tamiya normal acrylic, and both of those I don't use with water, I use them with Mr. Colour Thinner, so effectively turning them into a solvent-based paint. So MRP or Mr. Paint have recently reformulated and updated their aqua paint range. I didn't know they even did an aqua paint range, but given my disdain for water-based acrylics, that's not particularly surprising. So the guys at Premium Hobbies reached out and said, "We've got the new Mr. Paint aqua range in, would you like us to send you a few to try out?" And I thought, well, it would be rude not to. It's interesting. I enjoy messing about with these things and seeing how they behave. And, you know, thinking Mr. Paint is probably some of the best paint out there for my money, so maybe they've made a decent job of an aqua range. Who knows? Let's have a go. So they sent me some art. Here's what I received. They asked if I had any preferences colour-wise, and I said no, a random selection's perfectly fine. But please do send the proprietary thinner, just so I can use that to give it an absolutely fair shout, rather than messing about and doing my own thing. So I have gone a fair way off script here with this one, because I've actually written a script, not a script as such, but I've written down a few points so that I could try and remember to actually make all the points throughout this video, because I'm not talking as I go along, so I tend to forget things. And you might wonder why I don't use water-based acrylics as a sort of standard normal thing. And I wrote down a couple of pros and cons. And these are based on my experience and my opinions. So please, if you get on with this paint just fine and think I'm talking nonsense, don't take it personally. Okay, so pros. What's good about water-based acrylics for modelling? Well, I think the biggest benefit that they have is their lack of odour, and indeed their lack of toxicity. They're safe. If you have children in the house, if you have to model in a shared space, you know, where other people may not appreciate the smell of alclad, or if you have respiratory problems, you may not be able or willing to use lacquer-based paints, or even the sort of solvent-based acrylics. That is a big reason for using them. They're very easy to clean up, usually with water, particularly when you're using a brush to paint with them, and at the same time they're actually very good for brush painting, or certainly a lot better than the likes of Hobby Colour and Tamiya acrylics, which are actually quite difficult to brush paint effectively. And they're also very benign in use. They're easy to layer up on top of themselves and on top of other paints, because they're non-reactive. They're quite inert even when they're wet. So those are a few of the things that are good about them. The bad things about them, for me, lack of adhesion. They just don't stick to things. Particularly bare plastic. They're really bad. And even in most cases, even if you use a primer layer, they still don't really stick all that well. You can easily lift it off with masking and things like that. It's very easy to damage them with anything. The paint layer is just very fragile. Sanding and feathering that paint layer is nearly impossible in most cases, because of that lack of adhesion. The paint will sort of peel back and you'll get lumps and chunks coming away. If you do get some damage, it can be very difficult to effect a good repair because of that, because it's so difficult to sand it effectively. You certainly can't sand any of them wet with any great success. Moving on from that, with airbrush use, probably the single biggest downside is the tip clogging. The paint doesn't atomise as well as solvent paints do, probably because of the surface tension of the water and the viscosity of the paint itself. It doesn't atomise as well, and it clings onto the end of the needle and it builds up a big lump of paint on the end of the needle. After a while, and sometimes that while isn't very long at all, the airbrush will start making funny noises and you'll start getting spits and spots and chunks of colour coming off, and eventually it will just stop spraying altogether and you'll have to clean your airbrush. That is annoying. And lastly, it can be quite awkward to clean the airbrush after use, because water doesn't get every trace of the paint out, and if you're silly enough to forget to clean the airbrush immediately after use, you're in for a world of pain. Trust me, it's very, very difficult to get dried water-based acrylic out of an airbrush. So make sure and clean your airbrush straight after use. So thinners then. One of the ways I tend to try to get around the limitations of these paints when I do have to use them is by using different thinners. Rather than using water, if you can get a solvent to go in there nicely, you can pick up some of the benefits of a solvent-based paint. So I thought the first thing I'd do, and I will show you this, just quickly show you the results of using different things to thin this paint down. There we go. If you listen, that's how thick it is in the bottle. It's kind of thick, but it's not very thick. It's quite a nice consistency. So I've got 4 spots of paint here. Let's move that. And I'll use 4 different things to thin these paints with, to show you how it reacts with different thinners. Let's move these things. That a little bit more central, and then zoom in a tad. Here we go. Okay, so firstly I'll use some water. Got some water here in a glass. Pop it in there. And I think it's obvious that mixes instantly without any issues at all. And it thins the paint very nicely. Next up, I'll use the proprietary thinner. MRP Thinner and Cleaner. I'll use a dropper. I'll just drop a little bit of thinners on there. Can you see it reacting? It's kind of fizzing and doing weird things. And if you can just see that it's not quite mixing. I'm hoping it's easy enough to see, but it's not mixing, but it's not mixing with the ease that the water did, is it? But if I show it who's boss with the paintbrush, again, as you'd expect being the proprietary thinner, it mixes in just fine. Next up, a little bit of IPA. Same deal, pop a little bit on top of there, and again, hopefully you can see there's just a little bit of a reaction happening there. It's moving by itself, and again you can see that that's not immediately mixing, but again it mixes with a little bit of help, although not quite as readily as the brand thinners. And last but not least, Mr. Colour Thinner, the one that you would think really isn't going to work, and sometimes it really doesn't. There's just a trace of it doing that same weird little reaction there, and again the same not quite willingness to just mix, but again upon agitation it does successfully mix, although not as well as the others, and it doesn't immediately thin it, which is a thing you get sometimes when using Mr. Colour. Okay, so there you go. You can use all of those 4 things to thin this paint with, should you wish. So you don't necessarily have to buy that, because IPA is very, very similar. The sniff test of this, by the way, so what is in this thinner and cleaner? Normally these water-based paints, the thinners tend to smell a little bit like alcohol. This one doesn't. Here, have a go on that. That is going to clear your pipes. That smells very strongly of acetone to me, and on the label it says it contains butanone, and it has got danger labels on it. Okay, so that said, testing the paint out. I'm not going to do live action airbrushing in this. I've already done painting. It's just massively easier for me to film it if I don't do painting in front of you, and it's also massively less stressful for me to do it this way. So if you hate it and you'd really rather see live spraying, then feel free to let me know, and I won't do it again. I do have another paint test to do actually, so let me know what you think. So firstly, I decided to try a little bit of brush painting, because these paints, one of the great things about them is that they are really good for brush painting. So I got this old turret. It's a King Tiger turret from a model that I clearly never finished, but I've also never quite been able to throw away, mostly because I spent an awfully long time making Zimmerit for it. I started out then by painting this area back here. So these areas on this all were bare plastic, by the way. This is painted in the red brown, and this is 2 coats with a brush. There you go. And I think that finish for an armoured vehicle is perfectly adequate, but it's not perfect, obviously. I used just this normal pointy little brush, same one I've just been using to mess around with thinners, and this was 2 coats. So I thought, well, it's a bit kind of lumpy and you can kind of see the paint, the brush marks, so let's try somewhere else. So I moved on to this cupola. This was also bare plastic, but it does have a little bit of a light texture on it, as befits the subject. And this was 3 coats of the dark yellow. And truthfully, I think that finish is more than good enough. More than good enough. It's really, really very good. Then I moved on, did some green. This is 2 coats of green, all the same. Very acceptable indeed. I painted this bit of gun just to see what the finish could come out like with on a bit of smooth plastic, and it's decent, and it's scratched because I've been just seeing how easy it is to scratch it off, and it does scratch off reasonably easily, but not as easily as some that I've seen. But again, this was bare plastic. Finally then, I've got 2 metallic colours here, a steel and a gunmetal. I thought I'll just give them a quick look. They're noticeably thinner when you take them out of the bottle than the opaque colours are, and that's what you get. Again, same paintbrush, same unprepped surface. Actually, very decent effect. These are going to be more than good enough for detail painting on anything when you need to do little silver bits and what have you. And I particularly like the gunmetal colour because it's essentially black, but it's got that blue cast to it that gunmetal has, and it's very slightly metallic. It's nice. It looked very reminiscent actually of a black paint with a graphite pencil rubbed into it. So that was my brush paint testing, and I think that is all passed with flying colours. That's excellent. So then I moved on to airbrushing with my trusty 109 wing panel. So it says on the bottle of these to use a primer. It's recommended, there's your label, it's recommended to use a primer layer underneath the paint. This is to aid adhesion, but bear in mind that that doesn't need to be from a pot that says primer on it. you can use anything as a primer, and the main qualifier is that it is stuck to the plastic, because that's what it's there for. This panel was previously painted with a lacquer paint. It was either SMS, Mr. Paint or AK Real Colour. I don't remember which exactly, but I gave it a light rub down with a bit of Trizac and went on top of that. That's more than adequate as a primer. And the first one I went in with was this steel metallic, and this is what I got. All of this airbrushing was done with my Iwata Revolution, which is the HPCR, and it has a 0.5mm needle, and that is the finish on this steel metallic, which is very, very good. I think you'll agree. I sprayed it direct from the bottle initially, just put a coat down straight out of the bottle, no messing, and it went down perfectly well. I then thinned it a little bit to see what difference it made, and it did exactly what you would expect and want thinners to do. It made it go down just a little bit more easily. It was easier to keep the paint to a nice fine wet finish, and you do need to do that with these types of paint, because if you have a bad paint finish when it is wet, you will have a bad paint finish when it's dry, because they don't flow out or settle anything like a solvent paint will. So that was the steel, very happy with that. Then I've used white on the wingtip. Here it is, this one, MRP A002. 3 coats over a multicoloured base, which is the hardest thing for a white paint to cover, and 3 coats and it's absolutely fine. And that has dried to a beautiful, smooth satin finish. Absolutely lovely. And of course I masked this with tape to do that. Here is said piece of tape. I'll stick it back on. I've pressed it down firmly and it is not pulling this paint off. It's not having any of it. So, dark yellow over here. Same deal, sprayed it on straight out of the bottle, and I wasn't happy with the finish. It was lumpy. I didn't like it, so I decided to sand it down and do it again. And this is where the big revelation came in. As I said earlier, these paints don't sand well at all, especially wet. I got a piece of Trizac, and you can see that this is the very piece that I used, and I used it wet and I sanded it down, and it flattered absolutely beautifully. I then added a little bit of thinners to the paint and I sprayed it again, and that is the finish, and it's absolutely beautiful. Wonderfully smooth satin finish. It's lovely. Really, really impressed. And at this point I'm thinking, well, I'm sold. I don't really need to paint any more of this. It works. But I thought I'll go in with the green and just see what I can do for freehand edges, because again, this is one of the things that these paints are really bad at. And again, I sprayed it initially with unthinned straight from the bottle, and it behaved pretty much exactly as you might expect it to, and I got a very heavy edge, which I didn't like, so I decided again to sand it back. And I've left it as it was sanded because I'm so impressed with how well it does sand. You can see that has feathered into the sand colour absolutely perfectly. I have got some thinners on it, that's what that circle is, ignore that. If I tilt the light so you can see, it's absolutely clear to see that is feathered in 100% perfectly. There's no peeling or shedding there at all. It's sanded properly. It really does work. It's stuck. It's hardened up enough within a few minutes, honestly, to be able to be sanded wet, and it's sanded back just as well as that. Caveat, this was with Trizac, which is a 3000, I've camouflaged my finger, look. 3000 grit sanding media. I suspect with a coarser grade of wet and dry you might have more trouble, but this sanded it beautifully. So because of that, I had to freehand something else to see what sort of freehand edge I could get. So enter the old Hellcat. Again, Revolution CR 0.5 needle, slightly thinned olive green, probably 20%, 30% at most thinner. So not as much thinner as I would use with my normal paints, and that was the result. I know the difference in colour here makes it hard to see, but that's silver, so that's a pretty extreme test, honestly, and that is plenty good enough. And I've done nothing to that, I've not sanded that or anything. That's exactly how it came out of the gun, out of the airbrush. It's only 48 scale, and that I think you'd get away with 9 times out of 10. So durability wise then, I rubbed that with my thumbnail hard enough to polish it, and it hasn't come off. I'm going to try and make it come off now. I really having to press hard, and actually that's brought the paint underneath it off as well. So yeah, if you're knocking it that hard in normal use, you're doing something wrong. It's stuck. It has actually stuck. Tamiya and most lacquer paints would come off if I scratched them that hard as well. So I'm impressed. I'm really impressed. I can see this actually becoming part of my portfolio and genuinely being used quite regularly. So I suppose the only other point to address is the price. The thinners, 125ml bottle. It's not a massive bottle, but you don't need a lot of it in the paint, and you can be relatively frugal whilst cleaning the airbrush. Essentially use a little bit of this for the initial flush through, and then move on to IPA and use cellulose thinners to finish the job off. So this will last a while. And this is £5.50, which is par for the course. It's comparable to other brands out there. And these are £3 per bottle, which sounds a lot, but this is a 20ml container, 20ml of paint, where you'll be paying £2 odd minimum for Tamiya now, which is 10ml. So actually £3 is pretty reasonable. And as I say, in use you'll put a little bit of thinners in, and it does go a fairly long way. I was only putting a couple of drips into the airbrush for each thing. It seems like it's will go a fairly long way. So I'm thoroughly impressed with this paint. These are far and away the best water-based acrylics I've used up to now. And while they're still not a match really for out and out ease of use with the lacquer paints that I do enjoy so much, they're really not very far behind. And I think with a little bit of practice and fine-tuning of my techniques and the way I use them, there's not going to be very much in it at all. So these will be set to become the bench backup for sure, and for brush painting, detail areas, smaller parts for aircraft modelers, these are spot on. So a big thank you again to Premium Hobbies for sending these out. I do appreciate it, and it has been a very interesting little test session which I've thoroughly enjoyed. I hope it's been useful to you if you are considering these. If you also hate acrylics then do give Premium Hobbies a look and maybe pick a few up for yourselves to have a go with. I think that'll do it then for this one. Thank you very much for watching. Do let me know if you hate the format and want me to go back to doing live spraying of things for these paint tests. But with all of that said, I think it only remains for me to say, until next time, look after yourselves, look after each other, and Genesis out.